For exclusive perks and to see all our interviews in its entirety, go to the top line of the description box and sign up for channel memberships right now. Get never before seen content or opportunity to ask one of our guests questions, plus other great exclusives. The link is at the top line of the description box. What are you waiting for? Go, go, go! How do you feel about reparations for Black Americans, and others, that especially in this country that had to deal with the atrocities of, people who classify themselves as white?
Well, let me put it this way. I'm going to lose most of your Black audience now, but this is the way it is. The first modern human beings that came to this continent came from Africa. And the people who are suffering the most from COVID are Native Americans who came from Africa. Now, if you're going to give reparations, we better start giving reparations to the people whom we raped, killed, murdered in various ways, and whose land we took. Let's start there. I'm all for reparations from there. Want to give them back the land? I don't think you want to. I don't think you would stand for that for an instant. But and you need to realize that they were the first Americans. We called them Indians because Columbus and other people didn't know where the devil they were. So they thought they were West Indies. They must be Indians. They weren't Indians. They aren't Indians. They'll never be Indians. They were from Africa, as we all were. So if we're going to start with reparations, let's make reparations to the first people, the first Black people who came to this continent. Let's start with those people we call First Nations, because they were the First Nations. I doubt very much that there are unless you're in prison, and that's our new form of slavery in this country, is the prison industrial system. You know it as well as I do. But if you aren't in prison, you're probably not being enslaved, and you're probably not living on a dirt floor without any electricity, without any running water, without any central heating or cooling or air, and 100 miles from a hospital. But there are lots of Native Americans who are living in that very situation. And now somebody's going to say, we gave them the land. We gave them a postage stamp size of the land. We did not give them anything. We stole from them and gave very little back. If you're going to do reparations, let's do reparations for those folks first. I'm all for that. And I know now that that'll make a whole lot of people of color angry. But you have to, if you're gonna try to repair this situation, you better start where the worst damage has been done.
And what about the descendants of slavery?
I think the descendants of slavery deserve some kind of reparations, but I think the descendants of the First Nations deserve some kind of reparations too. And I think you can't do it for one without doing it for the other. And which one are you going to start with? Because you see, we tried to enslave Native Americans, but they would run away and get into the nearest village, and we couldn't tell which one, we couldn't tell them apart, so we couldn't tell which ones we had tried to enslave, and they got away. So we didn't start slavery with Black people, what we call Black people in this country. We started it with Native Americans. And we also brought indentured servants here from other countries to act as servants until they had worked long enough to pay back what it cost to bring them here and what they should have been paid while they were working. So that slavery didn't begin with people from Africa in this country. It began first with Native Americans, then with white folks, then with people of color, then with Africans.
We hear the word reparations being thrown around a lot, particularly in politics. And it looks like, I guess somebody got some information that Black people in America are looking for some reparations, because now we see that conversation. Well, would you offer it? Would you offer it? Would you offer it? Do you realistically see any type of reparation given to anybody in this country as we see it?
I think if you can prove that your people were one of those, was one of the families or a member of the family that was used unfairly, was enslaved, then that's one thing. But if you can't prove that, then that's another thing entirely. And I think practically every Native American in this country could prove it.
How would we
because their
prove?
names, well,
How would
they've got the,
descendants of
you
slavery
can go
prove?
through the, what?
I'm sorry to cut you off. How will Black Americans prove that if records and things were destroyed and we don't really have any actual proof of that? How would we prove that?
I don't know, and neither do you. But you can't prove it by just the fact that your skin is very dark, because there are a whole lot of people who came here not enslaved, who came with very dark skin. And there have been a whole lot of people come to this country without coming here as slaves.
So my question would be, what's your motive? What was your motivation for teaching against racism when you first got started? Was it like a particular incident that got you, or was it just your life growing up that got you to start teaching out against racism?
What my father used to say to us when we were young, there were three daughters. My youngest daughter died at 3.5, but I had two sisters that were older than I was, Emma. And he would say to us, "Don't bring any pickaninnies into my house as grandchildren." And then my daughter married a man from Saudi Arabia. And before that, I did the blue-eyed, brown-eyed exercise with my kids in school, with my third graders. And this is what changed my father completely. I took the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, filmed in my classroom. The second year I did that exercise. The first year I did it, it was just the kids and me. And then the word got out, this awful thing that this horrible person had done with these little kids. And I did this exercise the following year, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation sent a film crew to film it. They took that film, they edited the film down to half an hour and threw it into a film about Eskimos in Canada, and sent me a copy of the film. And I showed it to my parents in their home. And my father was sitting there in his blue bib overalls and his blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbow. And he was watching that film of those little white kids going through that exercise in racism, with the blue-eyed people being mistreated and the brown-eyed people being favored. He watched that for half an hour, and when it was over, he stood up, he took his red handkerchief out of the back pocket of his blue bib overalls, blew his nose, wiped his eyes, and said, "I wish somebody had taught me that when I was 9 years old." Now, I hadn't seen my father cry since I watched him cry after my little sister's death. But what he saw happening to those little kids, because of an exercise based on a physical characteristic over which they had no control, changed his idea about race and racism. At that moment, he said, "This has to stop." And he said to me later, when my mother was castigating me for doing such an awful thing to those children, he said, "Jane, you're sure you're right?" And I said, "Dad, I'm sure I'm right." He said, "Then by God, go ahead. Let the sons of bitches complain." And they complained. And they did worse than complain. The other teachers tried to get me fired every year because I was what I was doing with those children. Every year, 30% of the parents would call the principal before school started and say, "Don't put my kid in Elliot's classroom. I don't want my kid in Elliot's classroom." I'll never forget the person who called and said, "I don't want my kid in that N-word lover's classroom, but I want him to learn to read, so put him in there anyway." And he put him in there, and the kid learned to read, because I can do that. I can teach that chair to read if it had a mouth. It was difficult to be treated as though I had done something totally insane, when what I had done was create a microcosm of society in my third grade classroom. I did, for one day for the brown-eyed people and one day for the blue-eyed people, what we have done to people of color in this country for the last 300 years. We don't put a stop to it in this country. We think that's the way it is. We think if you're white, you're all right. We continue to do it. We continue to tolerate it. We continue to protect it. We continue to go along with it. We continue to hire teachers to do it. I've heard horrible things said in front of students by teachers who get hired the next year. It was the kinds of things that are said by coaches on some basketball courts and on some football fields and on some wrestling mats should never be allowed to be said. And the coaches who are saying them should be fired immediately, because you can't teach about racism if you're practicing it in the wrestling room, or in the locker room, or on the basketball court, or on the football field. But if I had done the worst thing you could possibly do by treating my little third graders for one day the way we treat people of color for a lifetime in this country. And we don't wait until you're born. We start prenatally. A group of midwives, registered nurses, called me last year and asked me if I would speak to them. I said, why? They said, because we work in delivery rooms. I said, look, I was delivered of 4 children in 5 years, but I don't know anything about medicine. I know about how a child gets delivered. She said, that's not what we want to talk about. We want you to talk about racism. I said, why? She said, because we know that children of brown and black mothers don't get the same treatment in the delivery room that children of white mothers do. And we're midwives so that we can go into the delivery rooms and deliver children and treat them all the same. She said, we can deliver these children away from the delivery room and they can get the same treatment if we're doing the delivery. Now think about that. We don't start with you. We don't wait to start until after you're born. We do it to you before you're born. And then we don't stop after you're dead. There are still cemeteries in the United States of America where black people are not allowed to be buried because those cemeteries are for whites only. Now, think about how ugly this is and how self-defeating it is and how much pain it has cost us and how much money it has cost us. However, you need to realize that the reason we perpetuate racism is because it is a moneymaker. You can build a prison. You can hire a bunch of people to guard the people in that prison, about 300 people. Communities like to have a prison come to their community because that's 300 people who didn't have jobs before they got there. And I have worked with some prison employees. And let me tell you, that's an interesting experience. But you need to see the film, A Class Divided. If you haven't seen it, get a copy of it and look at it. And look at what those people who are in the business of guarding people in the prisons talk like, the way they act, the way they think, and the things they are willing to do to maintain their position. We open a prison, we put you in prison for whatever crime we decide you have committed. And if you remember, 3 strikes, you're out. I do. That's another thing I remembered. Remember, the third crime that you commit can get you sent to prison. And in the prison, you can be forced to work for 8 hours a day for 22 cents an hour. The money that you make goes to the victim of your crime. Now, if there's no victim, where does the money go? If you force a person to work and furnish him food, lodging, and clothing, that's called slavery. Now, think about that. We have reinstituted slavery with the prison industrial system in the United States of America. And then you look at the percentage of people who are in prison, who are people of color, particularly the males. And then you look at how easy it is for a melanatic person to go to prison for the same crime that a melanemic person can do and get a slap on the wrist. If you think that our justice system is just, you're wrong. And if you haven't read the book, you all know the name of this book, so tell me what it is. Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow.
Yeah.
Have you read it?
Yeah.
All right. Isn't this exactly what she says? And if you look around and you do just a little bit of, just investigate a little bit, and you realize that she was right when she wrote the book, and she's right today. And what Bill Clinton did was cause a whole bunch, thousands of young black males to go to jail. You can send your raw materials into a prison and have something produced at a whole lot less than it would cost you if you sent those materials overseas or did it in the public sphere instead of in the prison. Our prison system is not a just system. Criminal justice is an oxymoron. It's mostly criminal and damn little justice, particularly if you're a person of color.
Absolutely. The exercise, the blue eye, brown eye exercise that you conducted in the 60s, right in the hills in the heat of the civil rights movement. I believe it was right after Dr. King was assassinated. Talk about the motivation behind doing
next
that.
Day.
Wow. So was it like enough was enough?
Yeah. No. Enough isn't enough. Enough is too damn much. Enough is too much. Don't say enough is enough to me when we're talking about racism. Any racism is wrong and it has to be stopped. It has to be stopped now for one really good reason. If we don't stop what white people, what melanemic people have been doing to melanotic people all these years, if we don't stop it now, we're going to have nothing but chaos for the next 30 years as more and more melanemic, so-called white people get more and more upset about the fact that their jobs are going to depend on suiting the person who is their boss, and their boss is going to be a person of color. We've got to change this system, and we've got to change it now. Martin Luther King Jr. had been one of our heroes of the month, along with, unfortunately, George Washington, who owned slaves, Abraham Lincoln. The Republican Party is the party of Lincoln. Lincoln was part black, part white, and part Cherokee Indian. He was a Melungeon. You knew that, right?
Mhm.
And if you didn't know it, why didn't you know it? I think that's just fantastic. You need to realize that. He and two of our other heroes of that month were Davy Crockett, who was killed while he was fighting a war to take over part of the Mexicans' land, and Daniel Boone, who took the land from Native Americans and made it his own, because that's what we did in those days. Those are our heroes of the month in February, along with Martin Luther King Jr. Now, most of those heroes should not have been heroes in view of what they had done to people of color, but they were heroes for us. And here was Martin Luther King Jr., whom I thought was all about hope. And for me, hope is an acronym for holding on to positive energy. That's what he did.